and then we'll allow the other one. Okay, thank you everyone for being here this morning. I believe I know most of you, but I am Mary Ann Boyd with the South Dakota Chamber of Commerce and Industry. The South Dakota Chamber of Commerce Execs organization contracts with us for administrative services, and I am the staff person who handles those duties. Since I did not make special plans with members of the board for the introduction and starting this session, to keep us on schedule, I'm just going to turn to Tara Wilcox, today's presenter, to offer a self-introduction and a few opening comments. Tara, welcome.
Well, thanks, Mary, and welcome, everyone. How many of you have heard that statement of just write a grant for that? It'll be easy. Those of us who have taken on that challenge have learned just how false that statement is. What we've learned is that the grant writing is not just an event, it's more of a process. And so today you're going to be getting 3 times the information. We'll not just be talking about grant applications, but also grant research and grant reporting. I am Tara Wilcox, Director of Nonprofit Development, with INP, a company committed to ensuring the success of nonprofits to sustain their mission into the future. I've been with INP for approximately 3 years now, but come with a 30-year background in the nonprofit industry. Professionally, I have been a director. I have been program development, project planning, foundation, and fundraising, all of the components that a nonprofit director needs to wear all at one time. Personally, my experience comes from a family nonprofit where we run summer camps for kids and adults with disabilities. So I functioned as the president of that board as well as a director. And I consider one of my top accomplishments is learning how to manage and lead teenagers in a summer camp session. There's been a little bit of HR background there. Those people who know me for my displayed thinking. I always have a marker in my hand and I am ready to map, draw a flow chart at a moment's notice. I also have a collaborative spirit and kind of love putting concept into practice. And isn't that the essence of grant writing today? So we'll talk a little more about all of these components and how they come together. These are the services that Innovative Nonprofit provides, everything from consulting, marketing, and fundraising, again, to help nonprofits sustain their mission into the future. We want to thank you for inviting us to the table, and we love to be able to speak to people in new areas. We are located in the Midwest, primarily doing work in Western South Dakota at this point in time, but we have team members across Montana, South Dakota, and elsewhere. So thank you again for inviting us to share a challenging subject to many that can be somewhat intimidating. So let me set the stage for you here a moment. Grants by the numbers. There are 86,000 grant-making entities in the United States. 15% of nonprofit funding on average comes from grants. I would probably guess that most of you would have thought that number to be higher, as do many nonprofits when they go into business. You can't expect more than probably 10 to 15% of a nonprofit's budget to come from grant sources. And even then, there's only about a 10% success rate when it comes to writing grants. The average nonprofit will receive 1 in 10 of every grant that they write. There's also some myths behind grants that I wanted to share. There's some who think that it's just going to be quick money. And really, you have more than a third of the grants that have a grant cycle beyond 4 to 6 months. And then another third would be beyond that. So it really isn't a quick process. There is a lengthy period of making the proposal visible, submitting the applications, reviewing the applications, and making the allocation. You can probably expect an average of 6 months for that process to unfold. Another myth is that an organization needs a department to manage grants. Believe it or not, 61% of grant seekers relied on only 1 or 2 people in the grant writing and submission process. There's also a belief that your chances are higher with grants from larger funders. Larger foundations, defined as more than $10 million annually, actually have lower application success rates than smaller organizations or funding entities that are under $1 million. This is often because the applicant grant pool or the applicant pools for grantees are a lot larger, according to Candid. The last myth I want to share is that the pandemic has slowed foundation giving. And actually what we're seeing is 6 to 9 nonprofit sectors continue to report that they exceed pre-pandemic giving levels. So now is a good time to write a grant. Those applying for grants will cite that they have really 3 primary challenges according to a study by Grant Station. They have a lack of time or staffing, which is real, because many nonprofits are wearing multiple hats. Second, competition for the funds. And there's more competition because there's more nonprofits that are being established every day. And that's why these tips are so beneficial, because it'll help you elevate above the applications of the rest. And the third is actually finding the grant opportunities and finding the right grant opportunities. The research process alone is overwhelming. So we're going to speak to that a little bit further as we move along. An organization does need to consider, before they even put pen to paper, if they are ready to manage a grant. And you have to ensure that your bylaws are up to date, reflecting your current mission, structure, and your practices, that you have systems to manage the funds financially, from tracking to oversight and being able to report on fund use. Do you have an engaged board that's going to help you make the decisions needed to move the application to submission? And materials that explain how your services work. It is still a common belief amongst funders that if an organization doesn't have a website, they aren't perceived as credible, and it inhibits their application from moving forward. Do you have methods to document and track the impact of your programs and services? We'll be talking a lot about how that data collection needs to be shaped in advance, and you need to be able to produce the outcomes that you cite from the funds received. Do you have a plan for who and how the grant funds will be managed? Who's going to be involved in the process? And do you also have tracking mechanisms for your other fundraising approaches? Because many grants will ask, who else is contributing to the project? There are multiple grant sources. The majority do come from private foundations. About 17% of giving comes from the private foundations. Only 3% of giving comes from corporations. You may be asking yourself, where is the other 70% or 80%? 70% of that is going to be individual donors. That is the number one method to supporting a nonprofit. So you'll see a lot of people shifting away from the time that they're investing into grant resources into investing into individual donor cultivation and stewardship. The federal government is another entity that is a grant maker. There are over 1,000 grant making programs offered at the federal level. However, the state level is a bigger funder than the federal level. They fund at approximately 47%, whereas the federal level is at 40%. There are a few cautionary notes, however, with government funding. Everyone needs to go in with their eyes wide open. Although they can be a real robust source of funding that enables programming expansion and even sustainability for many nonprofit organizations, because it infuses large sums of funding, there are some catches to that need to be understood before you decide to apply. It is definitely technology heavy with multiple software accounts required. You do need to have more research-based justification for your work. It can take up to 9 months for the review process to unfold. And the budgets they're very strict with and have their own guidance as what is and is not eligible for reimbursement. which is probably the #1 drawback to many federal grants, the reimbursement method. In some cases, it can take up to 3 months to get reimbursed for the services that have been delivered. So an organization needs to have money in the bank in order to begin the services so that they can then be reimbursed. So there is that gap of time that needs to be managed. There's also a risk of losing the funding or having to reimburse the funding if they audit and find out that there have been variances in our compliance. In many cases, they'll expect separate accounting and bank accounts, and they do require annual audits for anything over $750,000 in a given year. Outside of a government grant, these are the common grant components. You're going to have what you would expect: an overview of the organization, project description, the need statement, which is where you defend your mission with the data and why what you do and have to offer is needed at this point in time. The project plan is something that many nonprofits fail to do at the point of application. They often think, well, I'll apply for the dollars, then we'll figure out how we're going to use them. And their funders really want to see a very well-structured plan before the application goes into play. They want solid goals and objectives that you will be expected to report on. The budget usually is attached to a justification statement so that it can be interpreted by people outside of your industry. An evaluation plan, as well as a sustainability plan. And we'll talk both about those two components in a moment. I do want to mention, many funders are moving towards the letter of interest approach, where they require a letter first that they preview and then invite you to apply, which is a win-win for both sides of the fence, because it allows you to put in the least amount of effort to determine if there is a solid match before you put the time and effort into submitting an application. So it helps to assess that mission match directly from the horse's mouth before you proceed into application phase. This is just a diagram that shares with you that it is a process and it is a cycle, not just an event. Your first quarter is all about finding the right match and the right funding opportunity. I would say this is the most critical aspect of your grant process, because finding the right match will make it worth the time and effort you spend in preparing the application. Then it goes into, after the research, you go into the application preparation. Then you deliver the services in the application, and then it ends up that you report on the outcomes of that work. And so all 4 of these segments are equally important. Let's talk about the research first. Okay. First, I have 12 tips for you, and they're broken down into those 4 segments that we just spoke about: research, application, the delivery, and the reporting. Now it's all about the research. You want to begin with your grant writing by knowing what your niche is. Identify what makes you unique and different. What are your points of differentiation? What value do you bring to the project beyond what already exists in the spectrum of care or in the industry that you're in? Is it your approach that's unique? Your geography of where you're doing it because no one else is doing it there? Or is it your audience? You're doing it for a particular audience that maybe is not served equally, such as the minorities or the rural communities. Then evaluate, how does your proposal fit the overall needs of the community? A lot of times nonprofits develop because of a personal experience and it comes from the heart. But that's also how we get a lot of duplicated services as well. So have you looked at your community to validate that there is a need for what you are offering and what you propose? Is it already being done? Can you partner with them and collaborate for efficiencies? So the goal here is to avoid duplication, identify what makes you unique, and really basically promote those points of differentiation in your applications. You also want to find the funder's focus. Know what motivates them. Know what their intentions are with this particular grant. Know what sphere of influence they have. Do they want to impact their local community, or do they have a national scope of influence? What is their value system? All of this will help you to frame your content differently, making sure that you are really speaking their language. You're using it to pair with their individualized mission in mind. And you can adapt your writing style to accommodate that reviewer. Keep in mind that not all reviewers know exactly the detail of your industry, so you want to avoid that jargon and really speak in layman's terms. This all comes down to the fact that the right content funneled through the wrong channel is truly a misguided effort. Number two, after you know your niche, you know the foundation's focus, now you can look at how you align. And you want to look at multiple angles of alignment. Keep in mind, we are still researching and deciding which grants to write. You can use the 5 W's and plus H formula to do this. Make sure you align on the audiences you intend to benefit, the program deliverables that the grant expects, the timelines that they expect results in. Some people often catch themselves up when it comes to capital projects in this area, because they'll apply for grants that require to be used within 1 year, and they're still in the planning phase with implementation in year 5. So you do have to make sure that timeline aligns, the geographical reach, the social issue or the impact, and also your capacity to apply and deliver. If you have a small grant, but it's going to take you 15 hours to apply for to maybe gain $5,000, you're probably going to be behind at that point. So you really need to know, what is it going to take from me to apply for this? Who else needs to be involved? Because there is a cost factor to that. And the cost of the application and the cost of compliance needs to be considered before you even apply, because if you can't comply, you don't want to apply. So it is weighing the costs and the benefits of each grant opportunity. One tip would be to hone in on the annual distributions of a foundation to determine their scope and their scale. If it is a very large amount, chances are they're going to want to go for larger sized projects that have a broader impact. Okay, begin with the sources that are closest to you geographically, and work out from there. You also want to be aware of the timeline of your application itself, because sometimes there are current events and trends in the world that will shape funder priorities, and you may need to adapt accordingly. For example, the pandemic was not a time for art institutions to apply for grants. Everybody's focus shifted to human services. My last tip here on alignment would be to not just look at mission match. From that level, you might see that there is a really strong match. However, you need to look at what they do not fund, their restrictions. A lot of foundations will cite, we do not fund operating costs, staff wages, endowments, events, sporting groups, capital expenses. You can save yourself a lot of time by looking there and making sure that you are not intending to apply for one of those restricted users. And that allows you to move on to another funder who might. Now we shift into the actual application itself. Okay, as you look at your application, a lot of people say, how long should I plan on preparing my application? This is a tip that we often give to people. You want to take the number of hours that you feel you will need to accomplish the grant requirements. From there, double it. After you double it, turn those hours into days. Believe it or not, grant writing is always takes longer than you think. There are new priorities that are coming to your desk. There's technology glitches. There's team members that you need that one document from that are absent. And so it's always helpful to estimate the timeline needed to give yourself the flexibility to handle those day-to-day interruptions. Back to our 12 tips. Under the course of application, this is a critical one. You want to assess your internal capacity. Before you write a grant, be confident that you can deliver it. Some people have gotten in over their heads with writing a grant, received it, and then are like, oh my, we need a whole lot more. We weren't quite ready for this. We need more people. We need more expertise. We didn't have the process in place to do this. We really could have used that piece of technology. So you need to ask yourself these questions. Do we have the internal capacity to write the application, but do we also have the internal capacity to deliver the project? Do we have the time and the tools to meet the reporting requirements? We have the right people and skills needed for the project. This is not just a yes, no answer, and then you don't move forward if you don't have those in place. Instead, it allows you to determine or scale the project and to really establish what the needed infrastructure is. And sometimes that effort is worth it to implement that project, but you're going into it with your eyes wide open and your budget that matches the needs that you will have in the course of delivering this grant. I often tell people you want to begin with the end in mind. This is kind of back to the project plan sometimes happening after you get a grant instead of when you're applying for the grant. And a really strong funder is going to ask for this project plan. It demonstrates that your proposal is attainable and that you are serious about delivering it. It maps out a roadmap to your proposed destination. It identifies the other people that are along the journey with you, and it estimates your timeline of arrival along the journey in addition to the benchmarks that will denote your project. Do not wait until the grant is received to plan this project. Also, resist the temptation to overpromise in your project plan in order to be more competitive. And when you do that, inevitably, you run the risk of under-delivering. So be very realistic in your action planning as well. And the best way to do that is to engage everyone impacted by the grant and the project you're proposing. Okay, you have to engage both the doers and the decision makers. Oftentimes, we engage the decision makers. Who are the ones that can positively or negatively affect the project and can determine the success or failure? We go to them and they can help us to ensure concept viability as well as mission alignment, because it is tempting to chase the dollars. And in grant writing, you can see yourself sometimes in a grant where they say, I want this project. And then pretty soon you see your mission creeping into these other realms just to get dollars so that you could support what you originally started to do. So decision makers can help you avoid that mission creep. Your doers are those who are directly involved in the project, and they are supporting it from the back office. That can be your accounting department, but it can also be your direct support staff. They too can tell you whether the project plan that you have set forth is feasible. They're the ones that you need their commitment to making it real. So engage them in the process early on. Now we're going to talk just a little bit about that third quarter, which is the delivery of the grant. Evaluation truly begins when the grant begins. Okay, you need to know upfront what type of data needs to be collected, what is required by the funder, what is the data you want to know to dictate quality of your services, what tools will you need to collect that data, when and how will you analyze the data? I don't know how many times I see people who will collect the data, but then they don't know what to do with it, or they don't take the time to analyze it, which then can drive your next steps. The best next step for you if you know and interpret that data early on. Who is responsible for compiling the data and who needs to know about the data? So data alone doesn't have value until you put it in context of all of these other components. You also want to keep in mind with designing your data that there's two different types of data. There's your outputs, which are the actions, the activities, and the products that you're going to deliver, very concrete. And then you have your outcomes. These are the changes in attitude, behavior, and knowledge as a result of those activities. You can hit every output and still not have quality outcomes. Okay, that maybe shows that there's a disconnect and not a cause and effect relationship there that you maybe anticipated would be. Keep in mind, though, too, Albert Einstein said, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So how do you demonstrate collaborations? This is becoming a more and more important question in the grant world, and it's actually becoming a specific question on many grant applications. Funders know that collaboration creates efficiencies, it maximizes outcomes, and it further embeds a nonprofit in a community, which helps them to be more sustainable. For the benefit of the community as a whole, funders are expecting that collaboration. Your plan needs to include the supportive partnerships that already exist, in addition to how you can carve additional partnerships to complement one another as you deliver the shared mission. Again, it's extremely important, becoming most important on a local level as well versus the national level. In the process of delivering, you need to be real with yourself and your funders, in that you know that not every project in your mind's eye, the way you have mapped out in the grant and said that the project plan would look like, may not materialize as intended. And sometimes we see the funders as the judge and ourselves needing to aim to please. And I would counter that and say you need to have a very constructive relationship with your funders. There's some who want to be more engaged than others, so you need to know what their tolerance level for engagement is, and they usually will share that with you in advance. But if they are a true partner, they're going to want to know how things are going. They're going to want to know that you've run into barriers and how you're handling those barriers. Okay? You will want to track the lessons you've learned through the course of delivering your grant and be able to report on those when it comes to the final phase of the grant. So take time, though, to pause every now and then and conduct an internal evaluation using the data and your project plan to see, are we going the direction we wanted to go? Do we need to take a detour right now? Okay, simply be transparent in the journey. And when you are transparent with your funder, it definitely builds credibility. And in many cases, it creates an understanding that may result in additional funding to help you overcome the barriers you may be experiencing. So be transparent with the funder, with your team, and with your board. Finally, the reporting phase. This is a phase that we just got through discussing is addressed early in the process. It is not something that you wait until the month before the report is due to begin collecting the data that you need, because you may find that that data doesn't exist, okay? Unless you've been intentional about designing that. So you recall me saying that you want to begin with the end in mind. In the reporting phase, you are ending with the beginning in mind. You've now come full circle, and you need to reflect back to the beginning and how you defined success in the application. For example, if you say in your application that you hope to boost enrollment in your program by 30% with your renewed programming efforts, in your reporting, you should report on how much of that 30% was achieved. Sounds like common sense, right? However, you would not believe how often this is missed. A year has gone by and people just report on what they have They don't report on what they said they were going to measure their program success by. This was a quote from a funder recently. We get very well written grant applications that include great narratives and data points. However, the data points don't always make it into the reporting process. Keep in mind, though, that progress in and of itself can come in the form of those pivots that we discussed, those barriers overcome. And you can also use process efficiencies and improvements, efforts towards sustainability and lessons learned. All of that you want to capture in your report. But when it comes to core data, there's these three components. You've got your financial data that should align with your budget. You should use the same budget template that you use in the application for the fiscal report. You also have compliance data. This is where the output, you do everything you said you were going to do. Check, check, and check. Then you have your project data, which means what you intended to do, have the desired outcome. And these are probably going to be more qualitative, while your compliance data will be more quantitative. Okay. You'll notice that I didn't talk a lot about the budget, which is a whole nother subject, but you'll want to make sure that the budget that accompanies the grant includes justification statements, that somebody from the outside looking in can figure out how you came up with that number. Okay, what was the science behind it? Sometimes I've done budgets and even 1 week later, I can't remember how I calculated that line item. So you should always include that little justification statement alongside of your budget. The federal government actually gets very strict with this, and they require all of the justification statements for each line item on your budget. In your reporting, you also want to capture impact at all levels. When you think about impact, our minds as grant writers immediately focus on the specific project, the specific audience that you applied for funding. However, a funder has a broader sphere of influence. They are interested in how your services will benefit not just the individual, but also the broader community. And that the community is interested in how you are promoting social change and improving lives. Okay, so as you speak to your impact, you want to show up from the individual, the community, and the societal level all at the same time. Funders are also motivated to make a difference. When you demonstrate that change or impact is long-lasting, it elevates the value of the funder's investment in your organization. So if you have an opportunity, measuring both short-term impact and long-term impact is always a value add in a grant report. Okay. And the last one, when you are doing your report, you want to engage the heart and the mind. Impact should be relayed in a way that speaks to both sides. The mind hears and responds to the data, numbers, and logic, while the heart responds to a well-told story. Either of them individually are not nearly as effective when you put the two together. So you need to master that art of painting a picture in the mind's eye in a way that will celebrate the work of the organization. And the data talks to the left side of the brain while the heart and will speak to the right side. So it really is important to have some success stories, to have some testimonials, to really show a good story that highlights what you are doing as a part of the grant project. Okay. These are also not just valuable at the end in the reporting phase. They can also be shared with your stakeholders along the way as well to keep them engaged in your project. I would venture to say that most funders would appreciate those updates, especially when they're not asked for, but are provided out of a well intent from the organization. A couple other grant writing tips for you now would be, a lot of people say, can I just write one grant and then copy and paste it? I do recommend that you develop internal grant templates for each of the projects that you're seeking funding for. but never just cut and paste. You always want to customize that application. You want to customize it based upon what the funder's mission is, what their values are, the language that they use. That alone can make your application feel like it's really hitting the point of what they're aiming to accomplish. But yet you still have the depth of the content, you still have the data collected, that all it needs to be done is reshaped into a different size and form to answer the questions in the specific application. More and more, you are seeing that there will be online applications. And I recommend strongly that you work offline first, that you download the application, that you transfer the questions to a Word document, you begin to work it from there, and then cut and paste it back. The reason for that is there's a lot of character limits now involved in applications because of the mass of applications that are being submitted. The funders need to manage those applications, and length is one thing they can control. And so when you have character limits, you're always shifting the language to get the same concept across in the fewest words, and you're always checking your character count. So that works best in the Word format. It also means you have to do less is actually more in this case. You need to find a way that you can frame what you're doing in a very specific and intentional way. A lot of times we think it's better to reach different people by saying the same thing in different ways, and you may not have the luxury to do that. So it may be beneficial for you to have an outsider review your application before you submit it, knowing that that reviewer may not have any more knowledge of your organization than your colleague who you've invited to look at it. And they can give you feedback from the outside looking in. You also want to make sure if you do have a grant template that the support data that you use is intermittently refreshed, that data isn't 2 years old or 3 years old. That'll be kind of a tell that you are doing a lot of cut and paste type of work. They're expecting you to be an expert in your industry so that you know that what you have to offer matches the community's needs, which means you are aware of the data in the field. It's a tendency for us to elaborate on the problem because that's easy for us. We have the data, we know the why we're doing what we're doing. Maybe our solution isn't solidly formed yet. Maybe we haven't done our project plan and really mapped out what this looked like. So we stay in that safe language of paraphrasing and being more generic and general. And that means then we don't really focus on the solution. We focus more on articulating the problem. Make sure that you shift that ratio, and it should be 1/3 about the problem and 2/3 about the solution. Last but not least, you should have a grant strategy developed in advance. I encourage people to have an annual grant strategy where they do all their research, they identify which are the best to invest in, based upon the needs of the organization, the mission match, the feasibility of being able to, the capacity to being able to write that application. And then build that calendar out to where you have 1 or 2 grants a month, and then you work that calendar. In advance, you've already decided the grant, but you also need to decide what angle you'll take on that grant. So this grant will cover 4 things. Do we want to ask for capital support for a new playground, or do we want to ask for operational support or a new project to add an educational curriculum in the kindergarten classroom? Just some examples there that you go a step further than just identifying the grant alone, but identifying then which angle or which purpose you want to use that grant for based upon the needs identified in your budget. So obviously this grant strategy cannot be done by one person alone. It does need voices from the entire team. Grants are truly a team sport, as you noticed earlier. You've got the doers, you've got the decision makers, you've got the grant writer. You also have people that will be overseeing the project. You have your accounting department. There's so many different people involved in the process that the grants that you're writing should not be a surprise if and when you ask for their contributions to that grant and or that you receive them. I know as a director, I've been handed a grant and said, go make good things happen. We've got this grant. But there really wasn't a solid action plan for that. And so I had to lean on the people around me to make that real. It's about taking that concept and putting it into practice. So here's where we are. The 12 steps to grant success. I know I've spoken rather quickly today, but I wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to hear all of the information we had to share, knowing that you'll be able to come back and reflect on this in video. But these are the 12 steps in a snapshot view, from research to application to delivery and to reporting. If you can incorporate these 12 steps into your grant management process, I will guarantee that you can elevate your results and the results for your organization. At this point, I wanted to go ahead and open it to questions, and I apologize as I neglected to mention that previously, that we were going to hold questions to the end. I found that many times the answer to some questions are in the future slides. So at this point in time, though, please feel free to ask any questions or elaborate on the content that's been shared with you today. And if you wouldn't mind using the chat, that might help us as well. I'm just opening that up. See, we may have a few. As some of you may be pondering the question, or maybe just shy enough that you don't want to ask it in a public setting, I wanted to include my contact information here for you to use. I also wanted you to know that there are 2 handouts coming your way, one of which shows the life cycle of a grant that we saw earlier, and a brief description of typical grant components. The second document you have is more of a tool. It's meant for you to plan who's going to help with what aspect of grant preparation, your timeline for that, so that you can use some of the tools we gave you for project planning. And then it also allows you to track completion. So you can keep, it's more of a, you'll notice I'm a project manager at heart, and so it's more of a tool that helps keep you on track with the project. Okay, so the question from Derek is, in the event that there is a staff of 1, is your company one that can help with grant writing and preparation? Yes, we actually have found that the grant research process has been the most appealing to a lot of the people we work with, because sifting through the thousands of grant opportunities and finding that best match can be very intimidating and time consuming. And so we do have a Your Grant Companion project that identifies approximately 45 to 50 grants over the course of a year that are research specifically to the priorities identified by the organization. Now, when it comes to grant writing, we found that that is not always cost effective for the nonprofits that we work with, because it takes time and effort for organizations to transplant their passion, their knowledge of the organization, the detailed awareness of their infrastructure, and how the project plan will flow. And so we do provide those supports, but we actually prefer to do the strategizing after the research is done, and then also reviewing grant writing that you have completed and providing feedback to you, because that is the best way to hear a story and to hear about a mission, is directly from the source. So we do support it, but we do feel that it's better coming from those with the passion behind it. And we're happy to provide feedback and insight into how they might want to improve either the grant application or their grant strategy as a whole.
Kara?
Yes.
This is David Owen. I'm with the South Dakota Chamber. Thank you so much for some real good insights. One statement for the chamber execs that are here, kind of a question aimed at them, and then I have a question for you. The statement is, as we've seen at the state chamber level, some of our members, I'm thinking specifically of the hospital systems that are very large, have actually started an application process even for their dues. That has us, and that means Mary Ann, filling out all this kinds of details. So your comments about know your passion, have a focus, be ready, I think is increasingly relevant aside from grants, because I think this trend where utilities are being scrutinized about the money they give us. I think the large financial institutions will be doing this more and more, and I know the health systems are. So thank you, and I'd be curious if my fellow chamber execs have seen that. Is there, my question to you is, in your assistance for trying to find grants or helping in early stages, how is your fee structured?
The way that your grant companion works is it is just a flat fee that involves about, well, like I said, quarterly reviews of research after you're provided a core batch of 25 grants built out in a calendar format. And with that flat fee, we feel like sometimes you need even more information about the grant. So we create what we call a grant profile. It would be all the details at a glance that would have contact information, priorities of the grantor, annual distributions, timelines of application, typical grant amounts, all of those bullet points that will help you in determining if this is a right fit for you. We do that initial screening based upon a leadership meeting that we hold with the organization that identifies their top 5 priorities for funding. Sometimes that's a capital project, sometimes it's an endowment, sometimes it's for direct services or expansion, and then that shapes the direction we go in our research on behalf of the organization. Every month, though, we try to keep people on track with a reminder saying, hey, these are the 3-4 grants that are due in the coming month. If you haven't started and you intended to, now's the time to do it. So we have the monthly reminders. We also have like I said, the additional research that's conducted for new opportunities every quarter that are shared with you in a calendar format. And then the additional profiles accompany that as well. We do checkpoints too to make sure that, the priorities you've identified are still your priorities. And then following the original research, some clients have said, hey, the 25 alone are overwhelming me. What do I do with them? Which one do I do first, second, and third? So we find ourselves doing kind of a strategy conversation with our highest recommended items, what we would recommend writing which grant for based upon the research that we've done. So we help kind of kickstart that strategy. Most people will end up getting more grants than they can apply for in a given year. But what it does allow them to do is it allows them to pull from that research for the next 3 to 4 years as their needs may change. We're happy to provide a proposal and an outline of what that looks like. I may go ahead and provide our flyer on your grant companion directly to Marianne if you would like to share.
Well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, there is another question about a website or an area that names the different grants that are available. Absolutely. There's actually many of those. So even making the decision of which grant research site you're going to use, I would recommend Grant Station or Grant Hub. Both of those do have an annual fee attached to them. And those will allow you to pre-populate your priorities. And in some cases, they'll automatically route to you opportunities that they find are new. And so you can use that as a research guide. You can also search by geography, by any variable you want when you're looking at the match and the alignment. So that is helpful, but not all funders use the same grant site. So it's not a perfect system. I recommend, I usually use 2, if not 3 myself, because I find different opportunities in each one because they're designed based on voluntary participation from the individual funders. But it will include government grants, but you can go directly to grants.gov and you will find more about the government grants. And there is, I just thought of one more that I wanted to recommend, and it is called It's like the Center on Foundations. I'm going to look up that name exactly for you because it is a free source that doesn't require a fee. It's called the Foundation Directory Online. It's commonly used for grant writers, and it is free access in many libraries. A lot of the local libraries will set this up on their shared computers. So I highly recommend that. I have people who are professional grant writers that will actually go to this site first. And that again was the Foundation Directory Online, or for short, FDO. And there is a fee if you're getting it for personal use, but it would be free at your local library.
Tara, I think you've also wisely shared. I've been in the chamber management longer than a couple of these people have been alive. And so I've seen some cycles where chambers end up doing some pretty weird stuff because there was a grant that they could get. And so I have a old man slight caution, and you have spoken well to it. But you know, you can end up doing a sock drive or some kind of cheese festival that is not really within your mission, chasing grants that somebody knew about. And so Tara has spoken well to keep a focus on your purpose.
You know, I feel obligated to share this insight too. You know, a lot of people confuse sponsorships with grants. And I'm sure you see that at the chamber level. And I think there is a very distinct difference between the two, and not just in the use, but also in how you would approach to apply for that sponsorship. Okay, so a sponsorship is typically going to be locally based and from a business that's in that community. And they're typically going to have an online application that is maybe 5 questions, you know, and it's usually always event oriented. Okay, a lot of times in the corporate world, they're allowing those decisions to be made on the local level for a sponsorship. But they have elevated their grant making to a corporate national level, to where applications for grants for program support, not just to sponsor an event, are elevated to that national level for consideration. And there's a stricter rubric that they use for deciding, and a more set level of priority. So even corporations have had to redefine the structure around how they give. And that is one trend we're seeing. Sponsorships for events on a local level are a decision delegated to the local level, whereas grants for program impact and community impact are going to be passed up. The good news, though, is that if you work with them at the local level, they will pass on your name to the national level. So you don't want to bypass that local relationship, because they really do have influence on the priorities of the organization. The last item I wanted to share is the rise of what we're calling the volunteer grant. And volunteer grants are a corporation's effort to celebrate the work of their employees, the volunteer work that they're doing. So what they're agreeing to do is, in some cases, offer a dollar match for every hour that someone volunteers with an organization. This is a huge way to go for a nonprofit, because many of you know nonprofits need volunteers. With the volunteers comes familiarity with your mission. With that familiarity comes their willingness to be an individual donor. By the way, 85% of volunteers also give financially to the organizations they volunteer for. But now you have another incentive to, if there is a volunteer grant, that the organization will match their staff members' efforts by also giving to the locations that their staff volunteer at. This is a trend more at the national level with the larger companies, but we're starting to see it trickle down into some of the regional corporations.
Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing anyone or anything coming through chat. So Tara, thank you very, very much for your time today. Presented tremendous information for our members. We appreciate your time and we appreciate the ability to record this session so that we can share it further.
Thank you for the invitation and for your listening ear.
All right, then we will end our session at this point. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.